of your lectures. I admire you for still being here and you leaving your papers, your final essays for another 2 hours or so. So I have set myself a bit of an ambitious task, and with your help I should be able to present to you some ideas about Muslim publics in Africa. I thought that of spending a bit of time, I will spend a bit of time situating the particular method and the theory that I'm using in order to understand Muslim publics in Africa. Partly because it's a window, it's a particular perspective on looking at Muslim publics in Africa. I'd like to share that with you and also develop that. Then I hope to share with you I cannot go from Cape Town to Cairo. It's going to take you much longer than an hour. But what I've decided to do is actually to share with you both a lot of my own research in different sites in Africa, but also some of the research of my students that have been working in the project that was mentioned. I've been heading a project for the last 5 years on what it is called Muslim publics and values on the African continent, and we have been focusing on South Africa. We've been looking at East Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya, and then we've been looking at Ghana in West Africa as such. So I will provide, the idea is for me to give you a broad sense of the different kinds of Muslim publics in Africa, and then I will try to draw some conclusions and relate that to the broader literature on Muslim publics, not only in Africa, but outside as well. So, first, in order to situate this topic, the whole idea of thinking about Muslim publics, let me begin by saying that, in a broad sense, I'm trying to understand what many other scholars have been trying to understand for the last 2 or 3 decades about the revival of religion in the world, at least. In the 1960s and 70s, as you know, it was predicted that religion would actually disappear, that there would sooner or later development, science, globalization would actually lead to the disappearance of religion. And that has actually been turned around, but the problem remains, and I think it's still, if you use an economic term, it's still $1 million question. What is the nature of religion? When it has returned, or when it has become dominant again in the public sphere, what is its nature? Is it back again to what it was before, or has it been transformed? And a lot of the scholars who are working on religion in general, on Islam in particular, are trying to grapple with this question. Is it transformed, or is it a kind of a return to the old tradition? Now, one way of addressing this question is actually to take seriously the idea that we are looking at the public dimension. We are looking at Islam in this case, we are looking at Islam in the public sphere in Africa. So so that's the first transformation, at least from what has been before. It's not as if religion had disappeared in the 1950s and 60s, but it was assumed that if you want to practice religion, it would be in the private, or it would be within religious establishments, or within what is called religious sphere, and that would not necessarily be in the economic sphere, or there would be a clear separation between the different spheres as such. So because we're looking at the deprivatization of religion, that means religion making an impact in the public, in the public as such, it's interesting to look at perhaps at the impact it makes in the public sphere. Now, the public sphere, as you know, is a concept that has been popularized by Habermas from the 1960s onwards. He wrote his book, people forgot about it, and then in the 1980s, people rediscovered, oh, this is what you have been writing about. Perhaps we should actually revisit this tool, the public sphere, as a path towards democratization. Somebody like Jose Casanova, who's written one of the standing books in this, it's called Religions. Sorry, forget the title of the book. But Casanova wrote a book published in 1994, speaking about religion and religion in the publics. I don't think he uses the public sphere, that's why I got stuck a little bit. But Casanova suggested that maybe one should start looking at the public sphere in the same way that in the same way that Habermas had suggested, because when we start looking at the debates that are going on, the discussions that are taking place among religious groups or within religious groups, between one group and another, among the religious groups themselves. Maybe this will lead to what he called the third wave of democratization. That means, and he was looking at the role of the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe. He was also looking at the role of the church in South America. And so therefore that spurred on this idea of democracy, spurred on people who were working on Islam to say, let us pay attention to the public sphere. Maybe, so the paying attention to the public sphere was a way of trying to understand the revival of religion, but also the impact in the public. Now, scholars have actually, scholars of Islam in particular, have coined two important terms that I will be using regularly. The two terms are public Islam and Muslim publics. Now these are they have a technical meaning, and basically public Islam scholars refer to the fact that Muslims from during this period of Islamic revival have been making what they call, and this is a term that they use, enunciations. They have been making statements. Now the statements are not only verbal, but also gesture, body, clothing, all kinds of political statements that we're making, political acts. All these are expressions in the public sphere. People are making a claim that this is what Islam is, through their bodies, through their practices, through their politics, through their economics and such. So the public Islam are expressions. In English, more technically, it's called enunciations that says that this is what is Islam in the public sphere. And we are paying attention to these enunciations. Secondly, they've been saying is that these enunciations are not just once-off statements, but they are often part of a discourse. They are part of people talking to each other, part of people talking against each other. There are debates taking place among people themselves. So if there's a debate that is emerging about what is the nature of Islamic politics, for example, or politics and Islam, you would have several people contributing in this discussion, and that discussion or that discourse is what they call a Muslim public. Now the Muslim public is a discursive space. It's a space that is created by people sharing ideas, debating each other, discussing with each other. Now, if you think about that, this Muslim publics is not, in the past it used to be entirely among Muslims themselves, or in the past it used to be something that was dominated by people who were trained in Islam. But the interesting thing about this new development is that the Muslim publics is a space that is shared not only by people who are experts in Islam, but also people who just simply have the means to participate in this discussion. So here, and this is where the important point that they raise is that new media, and here with new media, it makes this possible in a way that was not, that was not to the extent that it was not possible before. Now, by new media, they're referring not only to what we would call new media today, but social media like Facebook and Twitter and all these and such. But if you look at a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, when scholars began to be looking at these Muslim publics and such, they were also looking at the impact of print media in the 19th century. That was then later developed into radio and television. Then later, as new technologies were developed, they noticed that more and more people were participating in the Muslim publics. So previously, it was people who were literate, people who possessed maybe manuscripts. There were lots of manuscripts, but they were still relatively small. But as printing was developed, and then later other media opened up the space for more and more people to participate. So in general then, what we have with a Muslim public Islam are enunciations, people who are making statements, and the Muslim publics are people who are debating with each other, or at least sharing discussions with each other. So that is the basic idea about Muslim publics that I think are useful to start to use as a window in order to understand what is going on in Islam in public life. Now let me also reiterate something that I just perhaps said in passing, that at the base of a lot of the research about Muslim publics was the anticipation, was the kind of what maybe kind of a hypothesis that because of the proliferation of participants in the public sphere, that you would get new ideas coming up. That perhaps to remind you about what Casanova was saying about democratization, that perhaps once you have, the debates on the Muslim publics not being dominated by religious leaders, or they are not controlled by the state, that you would basically have democratizing influences emerging as such. That was the kind of anticipation, but perhaps in some senses, when one looks at some of the leading scholars like Gail Eichelman, anthropologists, or Armando Salvatore writing about this, they were almost anticipating, starting to write about this in the early 1990s, that in spite of the fact that you are seeing all these radical groups emerging, but at the heart of it is a kind of the emergence of new voices of Islam that would actually be much more democratic, or at least they would be much more compatible with modernity than what we had seen so far. So with that, I hope that what I've done now is actually set up the scene for you, is set up the kind of window about how I hope to look at Islam in Africa, the Muslim publics in Africa, by looking at the public sphere debates, public sphere discussion. So I'm not, it's not kind of a ritual study or perhaps a narrative study. I mean, these might be included in the public sphere. The main focus is on Muslim publics, to look at communities of discourse, spaces in which these debates and ideas emerge, and to start taking a much more closer analysis of what these publics are in different African Muslim societies, and then to see whether we can come to any kind of conclusions about these hypotheses or any of these expectations that I have shared with you, as such. Okay, so the main questions really then for us, at least for myself, as well as for the students who are working with me in our research project, was what is the nature of these Muslim publics? Where are these kinds of discussions taking place? How did they arise? What were the kind of conditions that gave rise to them? What are the main values that are generated within them? And therefore, more equally importantly, who are the main actors? I mean, the expectation is that they will not be religious leaders. Perhaps there will be other kinds of people coming up. Is this actually true? And what does go on there, such? So, what I want to do is actually now let me also just pause a little bit, because I have hopefully set up some kind of a framework. If you have any questions or comments or something, or maybe not comments, but if you have any questions for clarification, then please feel free just to interrupt me. I hope that will be all right with you, that you might have some questions. And I hope that, because what I'm going to do now is try to be a little bit, at least something to be a bit ambitious. I'm going to try and go through different kinds of Muslim publics, different sites. I'm going to try my best to give you a good introduction to each of these sites, and then actually lead you to think about these Muslim publics, this specific Muslim public as such. I was thinking about whether I should actually just share one public with you, but I think that would not necessarily be Africa. So therefore, I've decided to sort of, go foraging, across Africa, and perhaps give you a sense of these kind of Muslim publics in different parts of Africa. And also, you will see the kind of challenges that exist within each. So my first my first example comes from Kenya, where from 1998 or so, a new constitution, the processes to write a new constitution was introduced in Kenya until it was finally ratified and voted for and passed in 2010 in a referendum. This was a this is one of those sites that I looked at myself particularly. I've been visiting Kenya over from 2002 until 2008. I managed to speak to a lot of people about this and to share with you some of the results and some of the ideas, at least, that I can share with you about Muslim publics as such. So the first thing that one can say about this constitutional writing is that Kenya, like many African countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall, were promising all kinds of liberalization, all kinds of more relaxation of the political sphere. And in fact, this was announced in 1992, but not much really was done until a group of Muslims and Christians came together in 1995 or 1996, they formed a group called the Ufungamano Initiative, and they went out and demanded the parliament, as well as the president at the time, Arap Moi, to actually introduce changes in the constitution, to actually set out the task of writing a new constitution. So here was a public space in which some, not all Muslims and Christians, but certainly significant groups among the churches, as well as some Muslim groups, got together and pushed for a new constitution, together with other civil society groups. But the important thing to note is that they were speaking the same language, in this case, Muslims and Christians together. In the process of writing the constitution, then laws were passed. In the process of writing the constitution, however, the issue of, in Kenya in particular, the issue of Muslim family courts became a contentious issue. Now, in Kenya, there are Muslim family courts. They call the Qadis courts, in Arabic meaning judges, or in the same word that is used in Swahili as well. And the Qadis courts are mentioned in the existing constitution, at least the constitution of the 1960s. And so immediately the Christians decided, or at least proposed, that the Qadis courts should no longer be in the constitution, and so therefore they should not necessarily they should not be in the constitution, because that would make the constitution a bit one-sided. It would have mentioned one particular religious symbol, one particular religious value, and not necessarily all the others. In fact, they didn't want a secular constitution, but they wanted a constitution that would necessarily be fair. In fact, their proposal was that it should be a religious state, a religious constitution, but it should not necessarily be a kind of a one-sided constitution as such. And this became the parting of ways between Muslims and Christians. Muslims in particular became very disappointed with that, because they felt that the Christians were opposed to some very fundamental traditions, a fundamental aspect of practicing Islam, that is Muslim family law, and they were very much resistant at changing that. Eventually the constitution was not, in that regard, was not changed. The Qadis courts remained as such. But what is interesting is, when I was doing the interviews, what I noticed after looking at the interviews all together and listening to all the debates and discussions, it became very evident that during this process, even though the debate was really about the contentious issue was whether there should be a Qadis court or not, the Muslim debate was really about the future of the politics in the country. And so the Muslims were discussing all kinds of possibilities in Kenya. They did not come to a resolution as such, but the possibilities were, some of them were, in fact, for example, supporting that maybe we should go for a secular constitution, we should go for a secular state, because the secular state will give us support. Others were saying, no, maybe we should go to what they call an ecumenical state. An ecumenical state would be a state where all religions have some kind of equal value or